John chapter 10, 11 to 14. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep knows me.
Thank you, Robin. It's good to see everyone this morning. How many of you were at Christ Teens last week? Let me see your hands. All right, yeah, a good group of us. Maybe I ought to just preach last week's sermon again. I don't know. It could be of some benefit. We'll actually recap that here in just a minute, but I'll tell you, from all I've witnessed and all I've heard, Christ Teens was a fantastic event, one that continues to touch hearts and lives for Jesus, and we're thankful for the opportunity to do that. Thankful for those who put the time into planning that, and for the impact that God continues to have through that. So, and thank you all for supporting our efforts in Christ Teens. It was a tremendous weekend, and we'll look forward to the next one. We are in the Gospel of John, and while this morning's lesson isn't directly related to Jesus' statement in John 8 where he says, I am the light of the world, it's all tangential. It all connects. Everything works together. The metaphor he uses this morning is a little different, but it has a consistent meaning. It's in John chapter 10, and the metaphor there is, I am the good shepherd. Jesus makes 7 I am statements in the book of John. Statements that go to his identity, to who he is, and to how we should view him. And in this one, he says, I am the good shepherd. Think in terms of farming this morning as we talk about it. Think in terms of what it looks like to have a successful livestock farm. Someone who is engaged in farming and taking care of animals and what that looks like. The Bulletin article talks about this morning, and I'll encourage you to read that, although not right now. But if you read that later, the concept is that there are a couple of different ways to look at animal farming. One has to do with elevating the animal, of taking great care of the animal so that you have great animals. And the other is using the animals to make a great income. And there are different ways of looking at that. Obviously, extremes on both sides that can be difficult, but we want to look at what Jesus means when he talks about being a good shepherd. What does that look like? In the times that Jesus was living and speaking, the concept of a shepherd was defined really by what they knew about David. David was their rock star in Jesus' day. They looked back at David as kind of the foreshadow of the Messiah. And they looked for one like David, and they were told to look for one like David to be their Messiah, one who would eventually rule over them, and that's who they thought that's who they depended on the Messiah to be, and thought at least at points that Jesus would be. And we find as we go through the stories of the gospel that Jesus' concept of Messiah was different than what they had come up with. God's concept of Messiah and salvation and moving forward was very different than what they had been taught, and yet obviously it was in accordance with God's plan and not their plan. You remember back when David was volunteering for service in the military. Goliath had from the Philistines, he was from the city of Gath, came down into the valley and was throwing out to the Israelite army, hey, one of your warriors come and fight me, and whoever wins, we'll just call it the battle. If your best can defeat me, then you all win and we'll be your slaves. If I defeat him, then we win and you'll be our slaves. And it's interesting that the story, can't spend a lot of time on it this morning. It'll be for another sermon at another time. But it's interesting that David, who had no military training, obviously he was very confident in what he could do and who he was. But he hears about the rewards that are going to be given to the one who defeats Goliath, and he says, well, I can do that. And they're like, come on, you can't do that. You're just a kid. And he wasn't a child, but he was probably a young adult, probably in that early 20s. And yet because he was the youngest, he wasn't allowed to serve in the military because the father was allowed to keep a son or two back to take care of things at home. And David was the youngest, so he was the one that was kept back. But like a lot of people, like in a lot of families, when a battle's going on and you've got people who are very patriotic, and apparently David's family was, the sons of Jesse were, David really wanted to be a part of the action. And you get the sense that when his father sends food to the front lines through David, he's excited, anxious to go, wants to be a part of that. And so he goes, takes food to his brothers, and he sees this giant down there making this claim, this audacious claim. And he says, how dare this man threaten God's people? I can take him on. And they take him to the king, and Saul says, this guy, do you realize this guy's been fighting? He's been fighting with swords and weapons since he was a kid, a young kid. You have no military experience. You're less than half his size, and you expect you're going to have any kind of success against him. And David says, I'm a shepherd. I got a lot of experience at shepherding. And you got to think Saul's looking at him going, I'm not sure those are parallel. He says, when a lion and bear came and took my sheep away, I pursued them, and I struck them and I killed them. And when they turned on me, God delivered me from their hand. And each time I was able to get the sheep that they had stolen from the flock and take it back and deliver it safely to the flock. Saul, mostly because he lacked any other volunteers, said, all right, I'm going to let you do it. You remember he let him try on his armor, and David's like, it's not going to work. So he goes and he takes 5 stones. I've got a great concept for why he chose 5 stones. A lot of people said, was he thinking he would miss? Well, and that's another sermon for another time. He took 5 stones and he turns to the giant. And you picture this. He's got this giant before him. The giant has an armor bearer there. So he's actually running at 2 people, not just one. And he begins the approach of the giant. The giant says, in his famous words, I'll throw your flesh to the birds of the air. And he starts to come towards David, and David ran towards the giant. Again, another sermon for another time. But when David gave his resume as to why he could do that, as to how he felt he could face this giant and be successful, he hearkened back to his days as a shepherd. And his days as a shepherd, again, show that he was the kind of a farmer that elevated the animal, that was interested in the livelihood of the sheep that were under his care, that was fiercely guarding the sheep under his care and loved them each one by one. He cared genuinely for each animal and didn't want them to go anywhere. It wasn't uncommon in the first century for those animals to be very precious to the people who owned them. First, they were a source of milk, a source of wool, and eventually some of them would have been a source of food. Sheep were a big part of their agrarian culture in those days. And so each animal was precious. It was their way of bartering. So animals represented wealth in those days. And so they were very important to each one of them. And they considered them to be precious. And so when they shepherded the sheep, it wasn't just I'll count. We've got about 100, I guess. That works. That's enough. They're going to know exactly how many they have. Jesus says in this passage, he calls them out by name, knows each sheep by name. And again, cares a great deal for him. The concept of Jesus being a shepherd of Israel was one that again was hearkened back to the Old Testament. To several passages in the Old Testament, but one particular that I think stands out, a parallel passage really for what Jesus is saying here, is in Ezekiel chapter 34, where he says, God is criticizing the shepherds of Israel for doing a very poor job in shepherding the flock, the people of Israel. He says, because of your selfishness, because you manage them only to get for yourselves, my sheep have been scattered to the four winds. They're all over the place. They're vulnerable to predators. And they're weak. You don't care about the weak and the fallen. Those who are sick, you simply let them die. And that's not how it's going to be. In Exodus chapter 34, he pronounces judgment on the shepherds of Israel and says this in verse 20. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says to them, that is the shepherds of Israel. See, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep. In other words, the rich who are taking advantage of the poor. Because you shove with flank and shoulder, butting against all the wheat sheep with your horns until you have driven them away. I will save my flock and they will no longer be plundered. I will judge between one sheep and another, and I will place one shepherd over them, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and will be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. In this passage, before we really get started, in John chapter 10, John is declaring to the Jews that Jesus is this shepherd that God sent. It's a messianic prophecy, and this shepherd John is telling his readers, this shepherd is Jesus. Jesus is the one that God sent to care for the flock of Israel. In other words, those who consider them to be in a part of God's sheepfold should follow Jesus. And that's what it's all about. John's making that allusion, and it's not accidental. He intends to make that kind of allusion, saying the kind of shepherd that Jesus would be. David, when he thinks of a shepherd, thinks of God. You remember Psalm 23, when he talks about God being his shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. I will be in want for nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures, leads me beside the still waters. You remember how that psalm goes, that this image of God being this benevolent shepherd, caring for his sheep, in that case David, leading him towards food and water, taking care of him during difficult times, being sure that he continually refreshes and replenishes, restores his soul, and then raises him up in the presence of his enemies. That's the kind of shepherd that God is. And as we look forward to this passage, to what he says here, Jesus is saying, I am that kind of shepherd. I am the shepherd that David was. I'm the shepherd that was promised in chapter 34 of Ezekiel. If you go to that next slide. So to kind of recap last week's lesson, those of you who are here will remember we were in John chapter 9. And in this, Jesus, in the very beginning of that chapter, Jesus healed a man that had been born blind. He mixed his spit with some dirt and made mud, put it on the man's eyes, and had him go wash his eyes off in the pool of Siloam. And the man did that, and it says that he came home seeing. That was a very small part of the passage. The biggest part of the passage is the attention that was focused on this man all of a sudden being able to see. It was unheard of that a man who had been born blind would all of a sudden be seeing again. That seemed amazing to them, astounding to them. And so when this man came back seeing, there were questions. The neighbor said, oh, surely this isn't the guy. And he said, oh, yeah, it's me. And they talked about it for a while. How does a man born blind, how is he able to see again? And they brought this man to the Pharisees because they realized, the man told them that it was Jesus who performed this miracle. They realized this is a miracle of amazing measure, of incredible measure. One that cannot be, it's very, very difficult to deny. So they took the man before the Pharisees. And the Pharisees wanted, like everything, to show that this miracle was not real. It was a fake somehow. The problem is, this man had a lot of witnesses, a lot of people who knew that before he had been blind, and it was very obvious that at this point he could see. It was an undeniable miracle. And it put the Pharisees in a real messy situation. They said, well, this man can't be from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath. He had healed the man on the Sabbath day. He doesn't keep the Sabbath, so he's just a sinner. And the man who had been born blind made the famous statement, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, now I can see. Number of statements the man makes through this time as they call him, they call his parents, then they call him again to answer these questions. Surely, tell us again what happened. The man said, what, do you want to become the man's disciple? And they said, we're disciples of Moses. You're this man's disciple. And then they continued to tell him, give glory to God by telling the truth. In other words, they believed he was lying to them. And he again said, hey, you don't even know where this guy came from, and yet he did this incredible miracle. In other words, saying, it's so obvious this man is from God because he did this incredible miracle, and you all just don't want to believe it. And they kicked him out of the synagogue, saying, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? Later on, Jesus finds the man, this is still in chapter 9, and says, hey, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man says, well, I don't even know who he is. And then you remember, oh yeah, he couldn't see him the last time Jesus was around him. Because he hadn't seen Jesus since he was able to see. And Jesus says, I'm the man, I'm the Son of Man. And the man said, I believe, and he worshiped him. Then Jesus looked at the Pharisees, and he said something like, I've come that the blind will see, and that those who claim to see will become blind. The Pharisee says, what, are you calling us blind? He said, well, if you were really blind, you wouldn't be guilty. But since you claim to see, then you are guilty. Your guilt remains. Well, chapter 10 is a continuation of that conversation. He goes into a different metaphor, but he continues to discuss with the Pharisees or criticize the Pharisees for their style of leadership. They claimed they could see, but Jesus said because they claimed they could see, their guilt remained. They continued to be blind. A spiritual blindness is what we talked about last time. And so as they talk about this spiritual blindness, he dovetails it into this metaphor about shepherding. It was a metaphor that all of them would have been familiar with. They all knew what a shepherd did, and they all knew how a typical first century shepherd would have conducted things. In the first century, shepherds typically had relationships with the animals that they were in charge of. They cared a great deal for them. They spent tremendous amounts of time with them. Every day they were with their sheep, taking them to pasture, allowing them to find water, keeping them safe from the threats that were around them, and then finding a safe place for them to spend at night. Animals typically would have spent their nights, if they were close by, at the family home. And I don't mean at the family home, I mean in the family home compound. If you go even to some third world nations now, those of you who have been there may have seen these family compounds that are basically places that are fenced, has the family home in the middle, and all the family animals are running around in the yard. That's what it looks like. We don't do that these days. That would look kind of odd to us. In fact, in Mexico, when we go to visit Mexico, in the Camalú, Mexico, it's in the Baja Peninsula, we'll be talking about, in fact, if any of you are interested in going and checking out God's work there, we'll be talking about the summer trip next Sunday, so March 11th in the Rock after church if you're interested in going to Baja, Mexico. But if you go there, you'll see animals are allowed in the house with the people. You go into the house to visit them, and you'll see a pig laying right there by the couch. You'll see chickens and turkeys walking through the homes. And you know those chickens and turkeys are going to be dinner at some point in time. Because that's just the way they use things, and that's the way they do things. It's how they live, and it's how they lived in the first century too. Animals were their animals were a very important part of their lives, of their success. And these sheep would have been extremely valuable to the first century people. They would have been kept outside, especially at night. Some of them would have had a place inside where they could come, but they weren't allowed to go into the family dwelling. But they could get inside if the weather was bad. But they would have had a wall. One wall would have been the family home, the backside of the family home, and then an enclosure would have been built around it. Usually made of rocks that had dried mud packed between them to look kind of like a rock wall. And this rock wall would have been 6 or more feet high to keep things out that don't need to be out and keep things in that need to be in, and would have had one door. The enclosure would have had no windows, no way to get in or out except for one door. And that's an important concept as we move forward in terms of what Jesus says here. So with that in mind, read through this first part of chapter 10 with me, starting in verse 1. Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, again he's talking to the Pharisees about this man born blind, the one who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate or the door, but climbs in by some other way is the thief and the robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the door for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they'll run away because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. As Jesus says this, remember, the man born blind is probably at his feet. The Pharisees are standing around who had kicked him out of the synagogue because he witnessed for Jesus, basically saying Jesus is from God and he healed my blindness. So he's there and he's calling this man a sheep, right? This man is the sheep that he's talking about, this man who was worshiping now Jesus. And he's saying, anyone who comes in by any other way but the gate is a thief and a robber. In other words, indicating that this man had come in through the gate. This man was a sheep. He knew the voice of the shepherd and wasn't going to follow anyone else. In other words, it really shouldn't surprise you that this man is following me because he's one of mine. He's one of my sheep. If you try to get into him and he's in my sheepfold, then you are a thief and a robber. You're just trying to use him for your own good. You're trying to make money off of him. You're trying to get something out of him. But I am a little different. Verse 7. Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. He who enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they might have life and have it to the full. I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as I know the Father, and the Father knows me, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and they will be one flock and have one shepherd. Jesus obviously being that shepherd. You get this concept, this idea of who Jesus is and what he's doing. He is the leader of the sheep. Clearly, we can see he's invoking Psalm 23 and Ezekiel chapter 34 as he speaks about this shepherd that God was going to bring to his people. Jesus in this is saying in a metaphorical kind of way, I am that guy. I'm the shepherd. I'm the one that God has sent to Israel. It's really clear in Ezekiel 34. If you read through it, we don't have time to read through that whole chapter. I encourage you to do that. But it's really clear that God is sending this shepherd, this David, who would be his servant and who would tend his sheep. He's sending them to the weak and the poor and the sick because he'll care for them. He's not going to be one of those who push them out of the way or who abuses them or mistreats them. He's going to care for all of the sheep. And he's going to gather the scattered sheep together again and fulfill God's will, that they all be one, and they're going to be in the sheep pen. An interesting metaphor, again, as Jesus talks about the sheep knowing his voice, the sheep knowing who they're talking to when he comes in and he leads them out. Let's go to that next slide. Because in those days, again, a family pen might have been big enough to house the sheep of more than one family member. So it's a compound. You've got several homes in this compound. All the sheep that belong to the people in that compound stay in the one pen. And they can do that because sheep know the shepherd's voice. I've never seen it happen. Maybe some of you have. But when a shepherd, someone who's caring for the sheep, goes in and he says, hey, let's go, only the sheep who know him as their shepherd will leave the pen. Anybody seen that happen? I've heard that it's true. Others have told me that they've seen that take place. But apparently, that's the message. That's the metaphor that Jesus is giving in this situation. He calls them by name. He starts going. And those sheep, not all of them, those sheep that are his, begin to follow him. And they follow him because they know his voice. Jesus says, I am the gate for the sheep. Anyone who enters through me will be saved. Anyone else, any other gate, is false. Anyone who enters any other way than the gate is a thief and a robber. They come to kill and steal and destroy. When Jesus says, I am the gate, and we're going to talk in another lesson about when Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. He says, I'm the gate. He's saying the only way to get into God's sheep pen is to come through me. Again, the Pharisees would have taken, he didn't say it plainly, they would have taken serious opposition to that if they had known what he was saying there, if they could be sure that he was saying that he was the only way. But that's exactly what he was saying. They would have said that our way is the way. We represent the law of Moses, and we tell you how to get into the sheep pen. Jesus says, no, there's only one way to get in the sheep pen, and that's through me. You got to come through me. I am the gate. And then he also says, I am the shepherd. And that's hard to imagine in our mindset, but very often, if you Google sheep pen from the first century, you'll see these stone walls that have an open door at the very front. It's a stone wall built in a circle that just has an open door. And what would happen is at night, these would be in all over the place in fields where the shepherds would have their sheep. At night, they would put the sheep in this corral, basically, with stone walls, with no door, and the shepherd would sit at the door. The sheep wouldn't come out, and nothing else would go in. And so the shepherd was literally the gate, and he would only let the sheep in. Nothing else could get in. And anything else that tried to get in was usually up to something no good, right? That's what happened. That's the image that Jesus is giving to them. I am the gate, and I am the shepherd. Again, in those days, very often the person sitting in that doorway is the shepherd, and he's the gate. That's what he means when he says, I am the good shepherd. I have come, Jesus says. Those who enter who aren't the shepherd are come for selfish means. I, the good shepherd, he says, come that they might have life and might have it to the full. The analogy there, the metaphor there is life to overflowing. It kind of gives the image of filling up a cup to where it's just pouring over. I come that they might have life and that they might have it to the full. That full and flowing over. Let's go to that next slide. Jesus says the good shepherd will lay down his life for the sheep. Others come to rob and kill and destroy, but the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. In other words, he's willing to protect the sheep. He's willing to feed the sheep, to treat them first, and if it means that he suffers for it, then so be it. If he has to stand between them and a predator, so be it. If he has to stand between them and someone who's trying to steal them or hurt them, so be it. He'll do that. If it means they eat and he doesn't, so be it, because the sheep are what's important. He's come that they can have life. They are his first priority. And that's the kind of shepherd that Jesus says, that's what I am. I am the good shepherd. I care about my sheep. The Pharisees, he's saying, on the other hand, do not care about the sheep. The Pharisees come only to manipulate. They manage their sheep simply for their own profits and for their own gain. They keep them at minimal subsistence. They give them as little as they possibly can so that they produce the wool that they need, the milk that they need, and then they can be slaughtered for food. That's the only reason they have them there. They're necessary evil, and so they're going to give them the minimal to make sure that they're around so that they can continue to produce what they need to have produced. They don't care anything for the animal. They only care what it has to give. That's the kind of farmers the Pharisees are. That's the kind of shepherds the Pharisees are, but Jesus says, that's not who I am. And he harkens back again to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want, or I'll be in want for nothing. In other words, God cares about me as a shepherd and gives me that life abundantly. It brings in the concept of of Ezekiel 34, where he says, my shepherd will watch over them. He'll bind up the weak. He'll help those who have fallen. He comes for those who are weak as well as for those who are strong. The good shepherd, he says, will lay down his life for the sheep. Jesus did that. He gave his life for the sheep so that they might have life after he went to his death. Jesus says that he is the good shepherd, and we get that. We get that concept of him being the good shepherd. Take me to that last slide. He is the good shepherd, and the sheep follow him. And we get that image firmly in our mind. Again, I want you to see the image that Jesus was giving to them. The idea that the Pharisees shepherd one way, I shepherd another. Those who follow me know my voice, and they follow. What about the perspective of the sheep? I mean, we get the sense here that the sheep clearly have a choice. The sheep that he's talking about, the people, clearly have a choice as to who their shepherd will be, or whether they'll follow a shepherd at all. They got a choice. They can follow this one who claims to be the good shepherd. They can follow these others, the Pharisees and those in that day who are claiming to be the shepherds of Israel, the leaders of Israel. Or they can just kind of go do their own thing. But think about it. In shepherd metaphors, the sheep want to follow the good shepherd because, right, he's the one who cares for them. He's the one who's going to lift them up He's the one who's going to take care of their needs, bandage their wounds, go get them when they get lost and bring them back on track. You get that the bad shepherds are only there because, well, they just want to make money off of you. They just want their livelihood to be bettered because of you. And if you go off on your own as a sheep, you're really, really vulnerable. Wolves are going to come and get you. Others are going to come and steal you and mistreat you. It's dangerous to go off on your own. And so you have a choice. And we have that same choice today, and yet here's what gets me is that so many people choose to follow the bad shepherd. So many people choose to follow those who claim to be leaders in this world. Those who claim to have the right way of things. Those who claim to be smarter than others. Those who claim to know the direction to go, whether it be scientifically or politically or academically. They know we're going to follow their voice. And why is it that people continue to follow bad shepherds when we know that there is a good shepherd? And let me tell you this. This is an important thing for us to grasp. People follow bad shepherds because they believe that bad shepherds will let them choose where they want to go. I mean, think about this. All of us kind of have an image for how we want our lives to move forward, right? We've got this image in our minds of the things that we want to be working towards. If you're in that high school, college area of life, you're looking forward to your career and maybe to someone special in a family down the road. And you see all of those things happening with adequate funds to support your family, no problems that are going to come about. You see you moving down a certain road. If you're a little older, you see your family moving in a certain direction. You see people making, your kids making the choices that you want them to make. And again, you keep moving forward. But we have this image in our minds of how we want things to work out. If you're getting towards that empty nest area, you're looking at what's retirement look like? What do things look like after my career's done? Where is that going to happen? And again, we've got this image as to how we want things to work out. And that image tends to be guiding. And a lot of it, I hope we understand that a lot of that's an illusion. Because in our minds, we don't plan for problems to crop up, but they always do. We don't plan for there to be difficulties along the way, but there always are. And that's why we need the shepherd to be guiding us. That's why we need to be following him. While the bad shepherd says, come on after me, I'll kind of let you go where you want to go. If the grass looks greener over there, I'll say, yeah, go ahead. That's fine. Whereas the good shepherd just says, follow me. That's a hard thing. Follow me. You see, Jesus wants us to follow him, but he's not really going to pay a lot of attention when we say, yeah, but Jesus, that pasture looks better than this pasture. Yeah, but God, the creek on the other side of this hill is really clear and the water's really tasty. I don't really think we want to drink out of this water. Jesus wants us to just follow him. Not our image for where we're going, but his image for where we're going. What does that cause us to have to do? We're holding on to a future that we've planned out for ourselves. He's saying, let go. Just follow me. Just follow in my footsteps. Let me lead the flock. You follow. Don't worry about where we're going. We'll go through some tough times. We'll go through some difficult places, but I'm going to be with you even in those places. Nothing's going to happen. Just follow me. I don't want you to hear me saying this morning that it's bad to make plans for the future. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that following Jesus needs to be the central focus of that plan for your future. That as you look forward, obviously doors are going to open up for you. Opportunities are there for you to choose a college or a major or a career or positions within that career or where you're going to live or what you're going to do. You have some choices along those lines. But be looking for the doors that God opens for you. Be looking for the opportunities he has and understand that those opportunities are going to far more likely be about growing his kingdom than your bank account. Okay? They're going to far more likely be tied to his kingdom, to growing his kingdom and to moving us forward in his kingdom than our advantage and to getting the things that we want. It doesn't mean we're not going to have the things that we want and need. We'll have some of those things. But that can't be the focus. If we're following Jesus, that will not be the focus. You can follow the bad shepherds if you want that, and good luck with that. But Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And when you're following me, just follow. Just go where I tell you to go. Go where I show you to go. And if you follow me, I'll give you life. And I'll make that life so full that you can't even imagine it. It's going to fill your cup and make it overflow. Just give me a chance. Close your eyes, let go of your plans, and just follow. I don't know what that means in your life. Every time I do these sermons, I pray that the Holy Spirit will guide you as to how you apply that. I know what it means to me. I know it means I've got to continue to let go of some of the things that I'm thinking in terms of my future and where I see it going, and be okay with just not knowing. Be okay with just following Jesus, knowing that he knows the way and that the way he leads will eventually take me to heaven. He says that the sheep will follow his voice. And I asked this morning, do you know the voice of Jesus? Are you following the voice of Jesus? Is it his voice that leads you and directs you in your life? If not, this morning, I invite you to hear the voice of the Good Shepherd, to hear the voice of the one who loves you and cares for you and wants to direct you into the kind of future that he has for you, into a future that will build you up and fill your cup to overflowing, that'll build the kingdom of God up around you and prepare you for heaven one day. That's the road, that's the path that Jesus takes. It's the way his light illuminates. It's the path that his light illuminates, the path that leads to heaven one day. Now, I'm on that path. I'm not perfect, I can tell you that. I don't follow it perfectly. There's plenty of times that the Good Shepherd has had to come and say, hey, Tim, this way. It's happened a lot of times. And it's going to continue to happen a lot of times because I'm just not that bright. I'll be honest. But the fact is that I'm trying to follow him. And I want to invite you to follow the same shepherd I'm following. Many of you are, and I know that. And I love you, and I appreciate that. I'm glad we're on this journey together. But if that's not the shepherd you're following this morning, I ask you to follow the one who promises life, the one who loves and cares for you, not for his benefit, but for yours, that wants to take you with him to be with his Father one day in heaven. Whatever you need to do, we want to hear it this morning. We'll have people around the room who can pray with you. If you have a need or if you know of someone else who has a need, they'd love to pray with you about that, to pray with you through whatever struggle you may be walking through right now or they may be walking through. We would love to pray with you about those things. The content of those prayers will be just between you and that person unless you specifically say you'd like the congregation to hear and to be praying with you about it. If this morning you're not a Christian, if you're not walking on that path that leads to heaven, if you're not following the Good Shepherd, we want to invite you to do that this morning, right now. Take that step. The first step is going to be in baptism, having your sins washed away and beginning to walk a new life with a new shepherd, a shepherd that will lead you to being what he wants you to be, will lead you in the direction of heaven, joining the rest of us as we make our way there. Whatever your needs are this morning, we want to be here for you. Please let us know by coming forward or letting someone standing around the room know what your intents and desires are. We want to help you with your walk this morning. Let's stand and sing this song as we encourage you to do that. He leadeth me, O blessed God.